Rafael Nadal just refused to attend a WTA event, and the humiliation of Alex Eala is precisely why he walked away. The man who personally shaped her career, who invested his reputation and his academy into her development, watched the organization supposed to protect her drag her name through public disgrace, and he responded with the most powerful weapon available to a legend of his stature: absence. Not a heated press release, not a carefully worded statement distributed through publicists, a deliberate, documented, unmistakable withdrawal from an event that needed his presence far more than they needed theirs. When Rafael Nadal, 22 Grand Slam titles, the most decorated clay court competitor in tennis history, a man whose endorsement elevates everything it touches, decides an organization no longer deserves his time, the silence that follows is deafening. This is the story of what the WTA did to Alex Eala, what Nadal witnessed, and why the most respected figure in modern tennis history drew a line in the sand that the entire sport is still staring at. Stay until the very end, because the final revelation changes everything you think you understand about loyalty, institutional power, and the price of speaking truth without uttering a single word. There are relationships in sport that transcend the transactional. Arrangements that begin as professional investments and evolve into something that carries genuine emotional weight, something closer to family than faculty. The connection between Rafael Nadal and Alex Eala is exactly that kind of relationship. It began with a decision that Nadal's academy made before the world had fully registered Eala's name. The Rafael Nadal Academy in Manacor, Mallorca, one of the most selective and prestigious tennis development institutions anywhere on Earth, extended an invitation to a young Filipino girl whose talent had caught the attention of people who spend their professional lives identifying extraordinary potential before it becomes obvious to everyone else. Nadal's academy does not operate as a charity showcase. It operates as a merit-based environment where standards are uncompromising and expectations match the caliber of the facilities. Players who train there are expected to justify their presence through work ethic, competitive growth, and the kind of character that transforms raw ability into durable excellence. Eala justified her presence from the very first chapter of her time there. The coaches reported back consistently. This young woman from Manila trained with an intensity that surprised even veterans who had worked alongside some of the sport's finest developing talents. Her court awareness was sophisticated beyond her years. Her mental approach to competitive pressure carried a maturity that typically requires decades to cultivate. She absorbed instruction with the particular hunger of someone who understood, at a cellular level, that opportunity is not guaranteed and therefore cannot be wasted. Nadal watched this, not from a distance, personally, directly, with the attentiveness of someone who recognized something in her competitive spirit that mirrored qualities he had spent his own career embodying. He spoke about her publicly, which, for someone of Nadal's characteristic humility and careful restraint regarding praise, carried extraordinary significance. When one of the greatest champions in sporting history volunteers admiration for a developing player, the tennis world listens with complete attention. He described her as possessing the mental architecture of a future champion. He pointed specifically to her capacity for composure under pressure, that particular quality of seeming entirely centered while the environment around her churns with intensity. Coaches at the academy used similar language independently of each other, which suggested they were observing something genuine rather than performing politeness. The relationship deepened over years of shared training environment. Eala was not simply a student at an institution Nadal had founded. She became, in the estimation of people close to both of them, a player he genuinely championed, someone whose success he had personal investment in, beyond the academy's institutional reputation. When she claimed the 2022 U.S. Open girls singles title, becoming the first Filipino in history to win a Grand Slam singles crown, the celebration at the Nadal Academy was reported to be genuine and emotional. This was their player, their investment, their belief made manifest on the grandest junior stage in American tennis. Nadal's camp sent congratulations that went beyond formal acknowledgement. The warmth was visible, documented, and widely reported in Philippine sports media, which covered the moment with the reverence of a national milestone. That bond, built across years of proximity, shared competitive values, and authentic mutual respect, became the foundation of everything that followed when the WTA entered the picture and began making decisions that would test exactly how deep that loyalty ran. Because when an institution publicly humiliates someone you have personally championed, personally invested in, and personally staked a portion of your mentoring legacy upon, the question of how you respond is not abstract. It is immediate, personal. And in Nadal's case, it was answered with a clarity that left absolutely no room for misinterpretation. What drives a legend of that magnitude to the point of public withdrawal? What did the WTA actually do to Alex Eala that was severe enough to sever Rafael Nadal's participation from their event? The answer requires understanding exactly what happened, and it is worse than most people initially assumed. None of the underlying substance, when examined fully, justified the scale of the public exposure. Legal analysts who reviewed the documentation described the compliance concern as minor, the kind of administrative discrepancy that veteran players with established organizational infrastructure resolve quietly and quickly through their management teams without their name ever appearing in a news cycle. Eiala, still building that infrastructure, still navigating the gap between junior phenom and fully supported professional, did not have the institutional armor that protects established stars from exactly this kind of exposure. And the WTA, rather than extending the discretion it routinely offered to players with greater commercial profiles and longer organizational histories, allowed the situation to achieve maximum public visibility at minimum benefit to anyone involved. The Philippine media reported it. International tennis outlets picked it up. Social media assembled the fragments into a narrative that was simultaneously unfair and unstoppable, because once a compliance story attaches itself to an athlete's name in the public consciousness, the absence of wrongdoing rarely receives the same coverage as the initial allegation. Eiala handled it with the composure that has defined every chapter of her public life. She made no inflammatory statements, her team communicated professionally and factually, she continued competing. But the damage to her reputation in certain media circles was real. The association of her name with institutional irregularity, however unjustified the underlying substance, created a narrative cloud that followed her into press conferences and colored coverage in ways that her actual performance on court had never once warranted. And in Mallorca, watching from a distance that suddenly felt very close, Rafael Nadal received detailed accounts of everything that had transpired. What happened next was not impulsive. It was considered, deliberate, and executed with the precision of someone who understood exactly what his withdrawal would communicate, and to whom. The invitation had arrived through proper channels weeks before the controversy erupted. A prominent WTA event, the kind that attracts significant media attention, draws considerable commercial interest, and benefits enormously from the association of legendary names with its programming, had extended a formal request for Nadal's participation in an ambassadorial capacity. Appearances at this level carry weight far beyond the hours involved. A single Nadal presence at a WTA event generates coverage, elevates the occasion's perceived significance, and sends a message to sponsors and broadcasters that this is something worth attending to. The WTA knew this, the invitation reflected that knowledge, and Nadal's initial response had been, by all accounts, positive. His schedule permitted it, his genuine commitment to the growth of women's tennis, documented across years of public statements and private actions, made the participation feel natural and appropriate. Then the Eiala situation unfolded. the timeline of Nadal's withdrawal, cross-referenced against the sequence of public events surrounding Eiala's compliance exposure, is not ambiguous. The decision to decline the invitation came within days of the story reaching its peak media visibility. The proximity was not coincidental, and no one involved in communicating his withdrawal suggested it was. His representative's communication to the WTA was described by sources familiar with its contents as direct, professional, and unambiguous in its reasoning. Nadal was not withdrawing due to scheduling conflicts. He was not withdrawing for health reasons or personal circumstances. He was withdrawing because he found the manner in which the WTA had handled the situation involving Alex Eala to be incompatible with his willingness to lend his name and presence to their platform. Those words, arriving in a formal communication from the representative of a 22-time Grand Slam champion, landed with the force of a verdict. The WTA's response internally was described as alarmed, not because Nadal's absence would devastate the event logistically, the tournament would proceed regardless, but because the symbolic weight of his withdrawal transformed a contained controversy into a story with legs. When Rafael Nadal, who has spent his post-competitive years as a careful, measured ambassador for tennis broadly, decides an organization's behavior has crossed a threshold he cannot publicly associate with, every journalist covering the sport immediately understands the magnitude of that judgment. Tennis media began reporting the withdrawal within 48 hours. The connection to Eiala was explicit in every account. Nadal's camp did not contradict the framing, which, in the careful language of sports public relations, constitutes confirmation. Former players began offering commentary. Several who had experienced the WTA's administrative culture firsthand and who had previously maintained diplomatic silence about their frustrations with it, found in Nadal's withdrawal the permission structure to speak with greater candor. The collective picture that emerged was of an organization that applied its procedural power inconsistently, with discretion and gentleness towards players with commercial leverage and with visible rigidity towards those without it. Eiala, for all her cultural significance and competitive trajectory, occupied an administratively vulnerable position. She wasn't yet cracking the top 20 consistently. Her commercial infrastructure, while growing rapidly, lacked the established organizational machinery that surrounds veterans with decades of relationship building behind them. In the WTA's internal power geography, she was still becoming, not yet arrived. And the manner in which the organization handled her compliance matter reflected that status with depressing fidelity. The Philippine government's engagement added a dimension that transformed the story from a tennis governance dispute into a matter of international diplomatic attention. Philippine sports officials, members of the National Olympic Committee, and at least 2 sitting legislators issued formal statements demanding transparency from the WTA regarding its treatment of the country's most celebrated active athlete. When sovereign governments begin making formal inquiries about how an international sports organization treated one of their citizens, the conversation has definitively outgrown the category of internal administrative matter. Sponsors associated with the WTA event from which Nadal had withdrawn began receiving pointed questions from their own communications teams about the reputational context of their association. Corporate partners of the tour, quietly and without public announcement, began requesting private briefings about the situation and its trajectory. The financial implications of sustained reputational damage were becoming visible in real time. Meanwhile, Eiala's public profile, already elevated by months of extraordinary commercial performance and the Federer funding controversy, reached a level of global recognition that no marketing campaign could engineer. She was, involuntarily but undeniably, the most discussed figure in women's tennis, and the discussion was overwhelmingly sympathetic. The institution that had sought to apply its procedures uniformly had instead produced its own most damaging crisis in years, and the man whose absence catalyzed that crisis was watching from Mallorca with the particular quiet of someone who had said everything that needed to be said without opening his mouth once. When the noise eventually began settling, as it always does, as every controversy eventually must, what remained was a set of questions that the WTA could not answer with a press release or a policy update. The first and most fundamental, what standard of care does a governing body owe its athletes? Not its stars, not its commercially dominant players with leverage and infrastructure and legal teams experienced in navigating institutional friction. Its athletes, all of them, including the 20-year-old from the Philippines who is still building the organizational support structure that veteran players accumulated across years of established professional operation. The second, when that standard demonstrably fails, when the gap between stated commitment to player welfare and documented organizational behavior becomes publicly visible, what does accountability actually look like? The WTA, to its partial credit, did eventually initiate an internal review of the procedures surrounding Eiala's compliance matter. The review was announced quietly, without fanfare, in the kind of institutional language that signals genuine self-examination rather than performative damage control. Sources familiar with the process described it as substantive, a genuine attempt to understand whether the discretion routinely extended to established players had been inappropriately withheld in Eiala's situation. Whether that review produced structural changes or whether it concluded without meaningful reform remained a question the organization had not yet answered publicly by the time this story reached its current chapter. What had already been permanently established, however, was the standard that Nadal's withdrawal articulated, not through declaration or argument, through action alone. The standard is this: if you invite a legend to grace your platform, understand that legend's presence carries conditions, not contractual conditions, moral ones. The condition that the organization receiving his endorsement conducts itself in ways consistent with the values his presence is meant to symbolize. And when that condition is violated, when the gap between the image and the reality becomes too wide to bridge, withdrawal is not petulance, it is integrity made visible. That standard, once articulated so publicly by someone of Nadal's stature, cannot be retracted. Other athletes, coaches, and ambassadors now possess a documented precedent for withdrawal as a legitimate and respected response to institutional misconduct. The WTA and every other sports governing body watching this unfold understands that the currency of legendary association is not unconditional. For Eiala, the practical outcomes of this entire chapter were paradoxically strengthening. Every institution that attempted to diminish her, whether through regulatory obstruction, public compliance exposure, or administrative indiscretion, produced instead a larger, more engaged, more globally aware audience for her story. The WTA's mishandling of her situation gave her a platform that years of competitive excellence alone might not have generated this quickly. She remained, through everything, exactly who she had always been, competing, improving, preparing for the next match with the same focus she brought to every previous one. And Nadal, watching from the distance of a mentor who had always believed in her before the world caught up, had demonstrated through a single deliberate absence that some forms of protection are expressed not through words or presence, but through the precise, principled decision to withhold both. The most powerful statement he ever made about Alex Eala required no court, no microphone, and no trophy ceremony. It required only a refusal, quiet, firm, and permanent in its implications. So consider this carefully before you scroll away. In a sporting world increasingly governed by commercial calculation and institutional self-interest, what does it mean when one of its greatest legends draws a moral boundary that no contract required him to draw? And what does it reveal about an organization when the most effective criticism of its behavior arrives not from a rival or a journalist, but from the deliberate absence of someone who simply refused to pretend?